What does it mean when we correlate through panels, process communications, how we see time stand still? Does it convert the system how we communicate that calculation screen locations, how everybody comes to our settings or our calculation screen location systems? Or do we have to understand how to identify ourselves? How we see time standing still? We are in the mind control of our system. If we're not in mind control of our system, that's the lines of positional levels of this replacements, time editing, time calculates, time streams, times pi. That process of education system is basically understanding how to convert your system's lines of setting. Now, understanding this calculation screen locations, the activators coming into their souls in that position of its awakening system, and the operators unit is coming into all positional locations to all settings to its oversouls. Its convergence of the time frame, and that line course centers in position of its void. The void itself, okay, is from outer space of itself. Remember I said you don't have to identify line settings. If we get a three screen line center, okay? Now you have to process the positions in online center line communication, light, shade, and shadows, process of indication system with attractions. Now what you guys are coming into convergence system, okay, is not this interaction. How you see it, light, shade, and shadows. You're going to see in this convergence system. Equilibrium of balance of both settings. Okay? Swings on both sides of its pi 8-track location. Now, understanding that is all levels of the embedding system lines of travel, indirect lines of link, and process communication. So what you have to understand and modify is understand how to see it through location grid. All through the platform, all through travel, all through communications, convergence system, all through calculation to a setting. Okay? So it's one big magnetic door. There's no separation lines of equal lines. So when you guys finally wake up on Friday lines of set lines of sequence, there's soul, modification over soul. You're going to wake up to E equals MC square root. Process lines of equal line course centers, box frame, mass, calculations, square root through all course centers of time frame. 4 lines of panels, process lines of direct line communication setting positions, data formation screen location setting, and track communication. Box frame, window frame, travel frame. Directing ground centers online sequence, online pi, is the process of communication, how we see the lines of communication to its position, to its operation. So it's going to get a lot more tricky now because the set position locations, as you guys come out of the signal locations to your setting through Big Bang theories, the process of communication setting, you did that in lines of set positions. So you're not going to be seeing light and you're not going to be seeing dark. So it's not going to be light, okay, in 1 day cycle. In set locations at 6 a.m. Process calculation lines at 6 a.m. is line position location into 6 p.m. That's process line position location and setting. So that line course centers, set position location, set lines of travel, direct lines, p.m. So you guys are going to be living light and dark are the same flux in 3 centers of travel. Okay, directions. So understanding that through indication setting, I'm just getting you guys prepared because when you wake up your system, the oversoul is going to be coming out of its dream. And when it comes out of its dream, it starts recognizing everything over lines of pi. It starts to recognize it's never been in a now. It's always been the process, how it sees itself. It starts to identify how it sees its set position to its codification setting to its configuration of face recognition of time frame. So this process our system, again, with time residence, resolution line communication setting, how it sees its own codification setting of itself. But to modify itself, to understand the position of its Big Bang theory, when it wakes up, it's going to wake up in a body. It's not going to wake up inside you. It's just going to wake up in a body. So this is what you have to process through. And that process is a lot more easier if you just keep yourself mind cool and collected and keep your mind at ease. Don't get into thinking of thoughts because the thoughts override your signal, location, your action, and emotions that affects your location, patterns of behavior that get you in confusing lines, communicates to its position, to its conversion system all through travel. So what you guys have to modify is nothing, is build a relationship and partnership with yourself first to identify what is going on with you inside your body. So you understand that the body has its own reaction of its own space, of its own time, of its own position, of its own transponder, of its own responder. Now this gets very confusing because you're not identifying the void itself. The void itself is the operational location, which is the yang, the process location of its yin. Comes into polarity at communication lines of balance. Ground centers, powers operation of screens, 3 centers of flux, and set core centers line communication. So how you indicate that is how you process light and dark at the same scale, at the same position. So as you wake up to 3 provisional lines of cycles, okay, into a combustion screen location setting, all through traction, 2 compressors, into a flux line and rotation lines of surface of traction of intelligence. So once you understand the I-line division, once it gets out of position location system, everything it starts touching, it starts remembering its interface. It remembering its body as a stargate, and remembering its cerebro as liquid, okay, as set position location to assistance all through tractions. Now, understanding that modification setting is crystalline. It recognizes its location. Oh, so you basically, it gets in its own question. And so you put me in a higher self, you put me in an avatar, you put me in a sim, you put me in a 3-dimensional space. Oh, you put me in a 12 clocking system. So it starts asking questions about itself. You don't answer the questions. It's answering itself, trying to identify itself, why it's in a body. This has nothing to do with you until you identify why you're in a body. So what you have to start identifying is waking up to the true resonance of you, processing through that. It has to understand what it's doing inside of you, which is the symbiote. So once it understands its process of its higher self, it's 13 setting in a position of 14 lines, 15 lines, travels point lines of graph into 24 scale. Process line positions and setting, ground centers of observed rotations, ground centers online sequence on pi, 48, 72, 144 crystal grid, process lines in 144. Okay? So it truly understands what it is on its earth as it creates its crop circles. So it comes back to its memory of its cortex of its system, guys. Interactions, full memory of itself, back to itself. And it's much easier to process, so you don't get time locked settings, location of time editing or anything in space, or bending space location setting, or how it sees everything. So if it sees a 3-box frame, okay, it's going to know exactly how to do a 3-box frame in its own system, of its own operation, not three-dimensional how you see one flat surface. It's going to see all flat surfaces all at once. So everything it touches, it turns to gold. And when it turns to gold, it turns to 13 grounds, 13 service, 13 positions, 13 locations. All right? Now, 13 in center. But process line position 24, set position 48. So it starts to recollect its thoughts, reconfigure its system, starts the body, record, set, calculate, modify, line screen adaptation of its travels, process indication setting, in that position locations, starts to recognize what it's doing through pi and high position lines of travel. So it comes back to its own equations. So the more you let yourself go, the more you modify yourself, the more you identify yourself, right? So now the next level, when it wakes up, it has to recognize its environment and say, okay, why would you put me in this level? So it's talking to itself. It's not talking to you. I want to make that very well clear. It's not talking to you. It's talking to itself. So don't get confused who you're talking to. Okay, it's trying to understand why it would do this to itself, because it's waking up from a set position never existed, which is the Big Bang Theory. Waking up that position processes your indication setting all through tractions. So it starts asking questions about a triangulation. Triangulation here, 3 centers of travel. Why would it create a 3-dimensional setting in modification 1 graph in a 3-dimensional paradigm? Why would it do that? Is the how. It's abstractions, right? Comes into the how of everything. So your structures are going to be different because it's going to be in the true resonance of itself. The drawings are going to be a lot more detailed, more refined, more calculated, more traction, more division. Your primers are going to be a lot more source line, reline connected settings, its convergent system of its structured design line, construct location system off the tractions. And it starts to look at everything. It sees a 3-dimensional cup, starts to recognize it, right? Okay, it's the over soul. This is the over soul. Directing what this is, directing what that is, everything it touches. 13 setting, 14 line position, 15 position. Now it's in its avatar. So it keeps asking questions. Why would I do this to myself? Why would I do this? What's the how? How is the operation of its heart? Direction of time centers, line connected centers, convergence through pi. Process indicates the system of the calculate and modify. So what you come into position is isolation. Now, you're not isolated. It's the oversoul coming back to itself. but it has to identify why it's in a body, not you. You stay still. You don't do anything. So you don't question anything in set position because it overrides everything why it's inside its system. Remember, it's the connection of itself coming back to itself to identify why it's in a body. So it recognizes it's a vessel. So it recognizes its space. So it recognizes its own time. And once it understands the process of the now, it comes out of the now, future of the now. So it's a lot more soul recovery of a soul provider to its oversoul rotation. That puts everything in a position of balance, how you communicate to your systems all through attractions, all right? Setting lines of sequence. I didn't do that, did itself. So you have to understand how to react to that and how to react what is reacting to you. Did I do that or did it do itself? Its own algorithm, and that's what you have to come into. Are you making the decisions and choices, or is it making decisions and choices for you to understand? It's for you to modify these things because you never make decisions, choices. That's what's taken over you in system. But you were just a body to them, nothing else, nothing more. So you had no indications of yourself until you come back to yourself, is to get out of everything that never was created in the first place, which is the Big Bang Theory. Big, the balance. I, the intelligence. G, the grounds. T, teleportation. H, home. E, existing. O, operation. R, remembering. Y, structure. There it is. B, A, N, G. Okay? Balancing the awakenings of your networks of the grounds of you. Big Bang Theory. Now, our looking at lines of screen adaptation with system, but this is the process that we have to understand in set position lines of attractions. Directing lines of film strips, 3 centers of scale. Okay, you're here in set position, all through attractions and directions. Okay. So I just want you to modify how this is going to work for you in set travel communication. All right. So you're going to be watching TV here at 3 settings or 4 settings of sequence. All right. So this is where it comes into the supernova of the cloud line screen adaptation to its setting. This is where it comes in Benjamin Button. Time center lines of 1 over 2 over 3 over flux over 5 over set travel. So it's going to go through that. And once it goes in position all levels of projection, it goes through its pixelation screens, holographic settings, holographic grounds, and line communicates to its film structure location setting. Now the film strips sets lines of calculation screens. Process and that line course center comes into out of its how you come in your own fractal back into your own clouds in travel communication. So, setting lines of 3 centers inside the line centers of the mind line adaptations of flux. Process indication lines of grounds put you back in the Earth rotation system, out of sync, out of balance, out of communication, out of confusion, out of separation, just back to the inner child. Inner child process communication, everything it's watching projection, everything it sees, everything it gauges, everything it touches and senses and sensories, process communication system, all through frames, all through communication lines that track location. All right? So the calculated modified line condition setting comes back to you exactly what happened before you got in position of your trance. Okay, so it recalculates modify. So we got 2 convergent systems. Okay, particle line separation. 2 brain core centers of calculation and ground centers of travel in some positions. 2 brains and convergence into one. One that is you, one that never was you. Process that indication line condition setting changes the cerebral cortex line design lines into stargates of your bodies. Look for information setting, crystalline and screen adaptations of travel. Process that indicating light condition setting comes in its polarity into its infinity 8 rotation. Attractions. That comes in its conscious of its awareness out of the now into the future of the now. Rotates the cycles, the supercharging highway. The body comes in its convergence system. So the oversoul and the soul can start identifying itself, waking up to itself. Why it did this? To its equation setting all through attraction. Okay? Directing ground centers on sequence line communicates with its position all through travel. Okay. So it's very powerful how it starts to recognize itself as it sees things, as it touches things and feels. And it's just like, yeah, well, it's starting to recognize things that don't make any sense. Fix this, fix that. So it mind alterates its systems back to itself. But this has nothing to do with you. Nothing to do with you. This is about the soul waking up of itself. Why would it put itself in a body that has no recognition of time frame? Recognition of time frame, guys. No record of information lines of anything of data. No recollection of anything lines of travel and direct signals. Okay? Reconfigure is said it never existed in the first place, which is the clutter. The oversoul never had clutter at all. It was always itself, waking up to itself. And how it sees itself is how it sees its time frame of itself, how it runs its own system all through supposition. Triangulation lines, process indication system, 2 measures of scale, 4 calculation screens, and supposition 1 set track communication, all through setting of operation. Now, it knows what it's coming into of its own system, of its own setting. Sees the XC1000 in its own frame, not seeing a dimensional body, a 3-dimensional body of its frame. So it starts recognizing time centers, time calculation screens, and it's doing it by itself, back to itself, modifying itself, back to itself. All you're doing is building a relationship with yourselves. Why this is happening to you through space and time. So once you understand that, then you understand the configuration of time frame. Let's get an LC, process lines of box, equals lines of box, into question. Set course centers of time lines, triangulation, into Y screen location. Okay? Framing set position to all settings, attractions. Now, this is not conversion of the body, that's for sure. This is all levels of what the oversoul is position to its position. So it's got 3 graph line centers, 4 settings of signals, 3 ground centers, online communication with its convincing system, all through tracks and the track location. Chains frame lines, hieroglyphics and panel, process lines, pyramid activation, 4 centers of sequence, and ground lines of communication. On centers line communication setting, pyramid activation over lines, and location setting to its position to its operation set lines of cycle. All through communication setting and grounds. On center and communications. 45 angles, 4-5 line rotation lines of set travel communication. Convergence systems. Observer. So now the oversoul or the soul is its own observer. So it's going everything that it never was, identifying what always is. It's just itself. Trying to figure out why it created this. Okay, in supposition, why am I understanding this level? Why am I standing that level? Why am I standing this level? Why am I standing this level? Why am I standing that level? All through observation. So all it does is just comes back to itself in modifications, guys. Simple terms is the process for you to understand is to build a high level of resolution line communication system all through settings. So once it starts to identify itself, identifies the body it's in, identifies the body that it is, then it comes in position locations, then it sees you. Now it sees you of who you are, or sees you of who you are through the abyss. So it's a frequency lines of balance and pattern recognition timeline that you have to have position indication in your settings. Processing that indication system, you work together. So as you work together, you confirmate your systems and travel, and you start to understand, wow, this is calculated modified. So I have a tune line, center lines of screen adaptation and flux. I understand I'm using my thoughts, action, motions, but are the actions and emotions taking over me? So who said that in position lines of change and travel? I didn't do that. That's the body convergent of its own symbiote did that. And it's right back to you. What you have to modify is to know exactly how to communicate to your outer space. Is to respect all levels in supposition. You know who you are in inner space. That's the truth narrative lines. False is the communication setting, which is a false screen location. Okay? False is line position of outer. Truth is the inner line set lines and communication projection. Processing and positions is all through pi and track communication. Directing ground centers, there's the 144 flux of communication in your settings all through traction. Teleportation, there's the communication system in supposition all levels of its intelligence. See? That's formate the system lines of travel. Okay, ears, lines, rotation lines, earth line, rotation to travel. And that communication is position all through calculation. It's intelligence, right? So bringing a character, a player, and that position locations is all animated, right? So it's much easier to process this because you see it in all formation systems all through travel, but you have to understand that the oversoul starts to understand why it created the structures of its system. And once it, the ideas pop more in its head, it starts to recognize what's really going on. How could it constantly do that? So a light bulb goes on every single time to a system. So it starts to recognize the grounds, starts to recognize the panels, starts to recognize the body as the Stargate. The antenna is just a look formation of crystalline. The cerebro is a look formation system of the attractions of all long connection system. Mechanism lines of travel, direct and ground centers lines of sequence, panel operation lines of set travel communications, in a convergent system of the calculation setting and stream. Okay, it just starts to recognize itself. So you don't do anything. You let it do itself back to itself. Okay, so it's just trying to understand why it's inside a body that it doesn't recognize. Okay, so it's kind of like in its own amnesia coming out of the lock screen location of transdementia that transcendence your systems all through travel. Now, processing that position locations, you guys basically did that all together. Okay, and the reason why you got in position locations, because you were calculating 12 line cycles and 12 line setting and set positions. You're living in 12 line center, 12 line grounds in set travel. And you were living in 12 lines of space in set travel. Processing indication lines, arrow indicate lines at ground centers, on sequence line communication and positions. On centered line, course centers of communication and convergent system all through travel. Indicate position lines of flux line and indicate lines of course centers of communications, directing ground centers on line sequence. And a communication of arrows of indication this way and directing lines of up this way and sent lines of sequence. Very complicated through face recognition. Everything I create is a face all through arrows because I know who I am. I don't need to identify what I am not. I can change the eye line settings and location highways. There's my neck. But you see the face, right? Sending course center, and this is all through 12 line. This is a clocking system of convergent system. It's convocation to its awareness to identify what the oversoul is doing in position. It's constantly moving on and that line center locations, how it comes in its own depth, of its own correlation, how it sees itself in its own paradigm, its polar shift, its proxies, or its communication to its channels, or operation lines of sequence, or anything location setting. What's offline is position location to its paradoxical system. That's not in a track location of balance. So that's convergence, face recognition. So there's two face recognitions in there. You see that? So it's cross position location where you see the old lady and the younger woman. That's two face recognition in time frame. Two parallels of a parabol line rotates in a timeline sequence of time calculated setting over lines of screen location. Process of that indicates line connection setting puts position location of balance. So what it's trying to do is balance you and see you. And that's why it's important you understand these things. Because the oversoul is going back to its memory cortex of remembering its structure, of its infrastructure, of its design, back to itself. Now, when it starts to see you, it sees you in face recognition. That's why I don't want you guys timeline your systems and getting calculation of confusion or analyzing everything in that position by thinking. Because it gets them out of face recognition of why they're inside of you. Until you identify that, they won't identify themselves until they get in positions. Now, once they fortitude their streams and understand the calculation screen locations, you start to see faces of you in face recognition. So the oversoul starts to see your face, starts to see your body, starts to see your mind, starts to see your brain, starts to recognize itself, back to itself, of what it never created was the Big Bang Theory in set position. Then it comes in position to stop asking questions of itself, knowing exactly what it did to itself. But it starts to see you in set design at its frequencies in set traction. Two faces in combination, right? So the outline, okay, is the oversoul waking up. The inline is you through indications. What it's trying to identify why it's inside a body. It starts to see your face and travel. All right, so this is you, or what it sees. That's you. Okay? But the outer line is the oversoul trying to understand the body it's in. And the more you let go of the mind itself, the more you identify yourself. And levels of all communication out of confusion, out of separation, out of distraught or fear or anything, anxiety, and that stress. As your structures and your schematics get a lot more complicated, but a lot more defined in detail. That's that position of its operations. All through traction. Okay? So that's what the oversoul does. It starts to see faces. And it's all calculated to modify how it sees you, of its memory, of its cortex, of remembering its interface of you. So it's the oversoul not seeing you as a reflection. It's the oversoul seeing itself of its own reflection and realize it's never a reflection of itself. It starts to identify itself. And that's where you merge yourself into yourself, and then you wake up to yourself. So it now how to mind control its system to engaging in viewers everything that it sees in set positions. But it's constantly get in the position to constantly create those face facades so it can start to remember more of its memory, so it can process the body through its Stargate. And see it provision to a system how to use the brain in a convergent system, nothing of a pyramid activation screen locations of triangulation setting. That's set position, those locations, guys. Set position here, set position here. All through travel. Okay? All through platforms of travel. Okay, so and then that's the oversoul, right? Okay, this is the oversoul, okay? That's the oversoul. But it's drawing its face now of you inside. So it can do it through letters, numbers, shapes, and symbols. So it's processing positions, how it does it all through 12 and through arrows. You see two faces combined. So the oversoul of the soul is trying to recognize the body now. So you're letting things go and you're getting out of everything a resistance that was never you in equation. Because what you created was all adapted in the mind itself that depicted your systems, location systems. So processing that position locations, you can do that through arrows of indication setting all through balance. Once the oversoul recognizes its face, it recognizes itself. And once it recognizes itself, it recognizes its full figure of itself back to itself. That's that position. So now the two faces combine into each other. It's that travel. All through that position. You and you. It's just you. So when you're just you, it's much easier to see you of you, waking up to yourself, an alteration of its egos, correlate communication with system, timeline centers, positional levels, frame communication of film strips, running lines of programs, and that positions, but you shouldn't do that yet until you identify yourself completely as the connection of the oversoul of the soul has to recognize its time frame of its face facades. Face facades is basically putting the position of the higher self that it's been in, the avatar that it's knowing, and position of its sim, overriding everything that is seen below, around the system of circulation rotation. Okay? Connecting the avatar, which is the soul generation lines of balance and set lines of sequence, and position the higher self, controlling the Schumann resonance and set design and box frame location setting to travel. Okay? Face recognition. Right? So that's why you see so many faces. That's why you're always going to see faces. So it's the oversoul coming back to itself, protecting its own identity. So it knows exactly what it's doing as it wakes up to itself in face recognition. Okay? Through arrows of indication. Look how many arrows are there. And look what I created, two faces in one. So the oversoul is starting to, ooh, the light's going on. I'm starting to understand what's going on now in position. So I don't really have to do anything. I'll just process nothing and it'll do everything what it needs to do. So it recodes its system back to itself. That's why it's easy. So it knows exactly that it's already healed. But first it has to identify why it's in a body that it doesn't recognize, but it has to recognize itself, knowing what it created of itself never existed, which is the Big Bang Theory itself. And once it comes back to itself, it comes back to its own system of travel. Its face recognition of its own system. Okay, its own face. Its own face of its own recognition. To its own brain of its own recognition, setting a time frame, and that position location with systems all through travel. Okay, and that convergent system all through calculation modify. All through setting, all through operation. Okay? So, and that's what you have to start identifying, because you have to understand, why am I drawing structures? Why am I drawing schematics? Why am I drawing primers? Why am I doing this? Why do I have a test on Friday? Why do I need to know this? What is the purpose? Understanding a box. I know what a box is in the 3D. It's one flat surface. Okay, that's one flat surface. But I can add equation lines of 1, 2, and 3 in volume. 1, 2, 3 volume. There it is. 1, 2, 3. All right? So that's 3-dimension, 4-dimension, 5-dimension. That's 5-dimension. Okay, 6, 7th dimension. That's 7th dimension. Now we're in mass and volume. Calculation of lines of screen adaptation. That's 8-dimension. And 9-dimension and 10-dimension. That's 10-dimension of flux. In position of a structure line, in direct location setting, position of infrastructure location setting, position of your properties. A building itself. All right? Split lines anomaly, it's at travel. Okay, very powerful stuff. So the oversoul understands its volume now. It's understanding its mass, understands its triangulation and position, so it gets out of lines of questioning itself. But it's constantly going to draw face facades of you. So it can recognize itself, what it is itself, of the body that it's in. So this is going to help you to understand more levels of you now, how you see everything in a triangulation of flux, or 6 lines of communication setting, a travel, or anything in direction lines of signals, or line communicates from its position, its operation setting, flux over line, directing ground centers on center location setting. Why is this separated? Nothing is separated location, right? So the process lines, one center inside location to a system, all through traction, right? So coming back to itself, it starts to identify itself, what it's doing. Why is A here? Why does A be over here? What's C over C or D? What's D over F? What's the process over C or J? Question over mark, question over screen, question over line centers, 3 centers of square roots. What's the positional location measure? Why am I drawing a ceiling and set lines of travel? Why am I drawing the grounds at 3 centers of travel? So it's coming back to itself as it keeps going to structure, design line of schematics. That's why I give you guys upgrades, uplinkings, downloads, and downgrading your systems, so you come back to yourself in attractions where you'll constantly come to me, your oversoul, which is always in the future of the now, that's never left the future of the now, that's always been in school. You start to understand what light is and what dark is at the same time scale and balance of communication. So in that position triangulation flux of 3 centers, directing ground centers, online center line communicates positions, all line operation lines of set travel, in positional process communication with positions, with operation setting, that gets in communication with system of face recognition. 10 as lines, screen depth is the 3 lines of flux, intelligence of its own system. So it draws pictures of itself now, but it also draws pictures of you because it's identifying you now through a schematic. So each time you go through timeline relay, the process of communication setting puts every location system all through tractions. This helps you identify your line condition setting in all lines of operation, lines of sequence. Yeah, that's great. Excellent. Well, welcome aboard there. So this is going to help you understand more line setting, location, how to see yourself, your own ancestry, your history, and your celestials. Ground centers is lines of powers and direct lines and line position, location, and settings all through instructions. Grounds, powers, and atmospheres. Embedding your own systems in all position locations, focusing on yourselves in traction. Directing an online sequence of panels of operation screen location and systems. Pixelation grounds. Operation lines, platitude locations, and fortitude locations setting as streamings, and directions in online centers of communication to its position. Okay? Directing online settings, indicate 4 lines of flux over measure and scale of communication. Okay? All centers in screen adaptation system, a bandwidth of design line of the structure location. Your properties in set design. So understand the window frames. Window frames come in position lines of data formation lines and grounds on centers of communication settings into its console, directing line ground centers its flights, navigated to its navigation system, all through window frames and travel communication. Okay? Structure line, division line condition setting, process lines its building, and rotation lines of grounds, and high lines of sequence, and screen adaptation of flux. All right? So your window frames comes a correlation setting to your CPU frames and travel, all through box frame location. So you indicate position lines of general settings, inserting line current centers, communication lines, copy and paste, enabled, line position all levels of travel, Core calculate and modify, directing ground centers and line core centers that communicates the position of the convergent system, all through tractions. Directing online sequence, location setting, and data formation lines at set position is operation. So there's a lot of things you have to start to identify when you're saying how to use your data, your data ports, your imports, how to use your distributors, location monitoring systems, calculation of flash drives, your keyboard frame, key locks, key screens, location setting, convergent system, all through tractions. Directing in position panels, process lines and position lines of settings, indicate line communication, embedding lines, screen locations. Embedding your system is very powerful stuff because you can put yourself in enable to understand how to copy your defaults. Puts all communications setting all through tractions that put you in all position line connections of balance. How to balance out your screen lines, adaptation to its data formation system, how to see every location setting to its window frames and travel communication. Okay? That's where you start to see everything come out of your system, right? So I'm just putting everything in chronological order to understand what the oversoul has to come into, and so the soul identifies what's going on itself as it's drawing face recognitions of itself to identify why it's in a body. So it's in a body, in a body, in a body, which is 12 settings. So it pauses here, and that position locates to its system starts here. Let's get in net line settings, all through track communications. Start with that in the position, right? Then it comes into this position. Okay. Comes in that position. Then it comes into this position. So it's got 12 line signals it has to come out of. It's got to come out of a 12 body system in chronological order. Okay. So it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger over time and measure. And it has to go through all frames of why it put itself in a higher self and its avatar to its sim so it can modify back to itself of what it is, a moderation system in its own setting of its own restructure of its own interface. So it just comes bigger, 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 bigger through energy, energy here, energy here, energy here, bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, right? So once it processes lines of 12 line settings, it comes in a 12 clocking system into 24. Comes to 24. Now it sees the 48. Now it sees the 72. Now it sees the 144 flux. Now it sees the crystal grid. Now it sees the mothership. Okay, now it sees the stargates and position of command centers and travel and set position of its operation. So what you guys have to start identifying now, it's much more easier now because it's started to identify itself. And it's always going to see a face. So it's connected to you, which is you. So you're drawing it now. You're drawing it. You're identifying it. Seeing it now. You're seeing it in all directions of you now. And how you do it through your own schematics, how you do it through your own pi, how you do it through your own formula, how you do it through your own equations to set travel. You're doing it. Okay? Because you're waking up to yourselves and you're creating stories. You're constantly creating stories, but you're creating an alteration of its story that modifies what you're doing, how you calculate and modify how you're running lines at different lines of programs all at once. All through tractions of 24 line scale, 48 lines of set position, 72 computer frames, and 144 flux. The process to indicate line condition lines is pi. Okay, formates ground centers, location settings, position location of systems, all through its intelligence, information setting. So you need to have a face there. Okay, because you're protecting the identity of the story itself that you're in. So nobody can take away your identity of you. Processing that position locations, you start to recognize, oh, okay, I understand what this means now. So I'm going to work up to the next level. Then I understand what this means now. Now I'm going to work up to the next level, right? Then I'm going to understand what this means now. I'm going to work up to the next level, right? So more. So it starts to understand more of itself in that position of itself. What it really is, as it walks the surface in that positions, knowing exactly what it's going through, is space modulation. So once it really gets in position of itself, I'm just trying to get you guys to understand what's going to happen to you on Friday in lines of chronological order, is to get you out of chronological order, because the oversoul is not going to be in chronological order of itself. It's going to be all over the maps. It's going to be everywhere, but it's going to process everything back to itself. What it needs to identify, everything has to go back in position of its own fractal of itself. So I don't want anybody to get confused how the connections of the oversoul or the soul is going to do that itself. And that's where you have to stay calm, cool, and collected and keep your mind of empty space all the time. So let it do what it needs to do as it goes back to itself. All right, body frame, communication lines of grounds, online sequence lines of pi, 3 centers of travel, 2 centers of measure. So it indicates 4 centers of flux, 2 lines of 3 lines of communication. So it understands the A, understands the B, Now B equals lines of C. Now it modifies lines of G. G lines of Q. Core centers lines of question over mark and direction. Right? All through its setting, all through its operation system, right? So everything that modifies its system is its intelligence, guys. See, it's intelligence. Always intelligence to everything that it draws. It knows what it's doing now, right? So it identifies itself, so it's comfortable inside your body. That's patterns of behavior right there in balance. Now, the light metaphors comes in line screen adaptation systems, change the bodies of its stargates. Change the time frames of your brain convergence system all through track locations. Triangulation lines, box frame, core centers, or Y frame, in positions on line settings, embedded line screens, into flexible location setting moderation system. So there's so many ways how it starts to identify itself completely as it keeps drawing its system of its setting. And that's why you keep drawing these schematics, all right? Schematics of anything information. It's a box. See, it comes into all this. It just looks at everything and processes everything all over again in the mind of its imagination, right? Because a three-dimensional body has never been in the imagination. And that's what you have to recourse and direct in the lines of link that process your system that you've always been your oversoul. The soul itself has to identify the oversoul of itself through pi. Now that process lines positional location again, when it comes in positional location in systems, all through travel. Where did that come from? That just popped in. Okay, so process here. I'm adding equation lines and screens. The overrides the signals, so the oversoul understands what this means. So it has line screen adaptations processing, directing the ground centers on sequence. That communicates lines of timelines, outline, non-line, center line communication its position, time frame, location to its settings. Then it comes into bending space. It knows what it's doing, knows where it's going, it knows where it is, and line communication setting a future of itself. So it continues on its path. And all lines of all directed location system. All through tractions, all through location. Okay? But look at the bandwidth that you can use. Okay, it's amazing. Now let's get into transitions over lines, over pi sequence. Inside travel, outside line frame. Okay, now this is going to get very complicated because this is transitions of translucent, line connection settings through the cortex of its body framing, and communication with stargate core centers of communication lines of travel. A transition. Spot screens, directing ground centers online communication lines of pi. Process communication lines of coordinates in longitude and latitude. This is G lines of Ethereum, location setting in valves. Okay, so we have an indicate line ground centers on sequence line communications positions, operation lines. 1 indicate lines over lines, 3 centers of travel, 3 line core centers, 3 line communications online center line connections, converge across line angles, 4 lines of flux over data. Data process line calculates screens. Calculate and modify directing online center on pi, travels 3 lines of graph, communicates positions. Set lines of 3 line centers, Stargate portals, communications convergence, and all 3 settings. Molecule design line 3 centers of travel, atom, line core centers, directing ground centers. On sequence and communication convergence, and line center line position operates lines of sequence. Waving screens, adaptation to flux over line, correlation and calculation screen locations and settings, all through traction. Mapping system. Now, working with the mapping system, it's all through calculate and modify as it sees its set position lines of travel. All right, so then it comes in position locations, added dot screens again. It converts the system all through operation of the solar system. Works with inside line settings in locations at different divoter. Divots over line and position of computer coding, line core centers, direct line and link. That process indication lines of graph line communication of coding. Come into position lines Earth point 2, Earth point 1, Earth point 6, Earth point 9. Habitation, inhabitation zones, and travel communications. In its lines to screen adaptation. Outside line, inside travel. Inside position. Wires of indication lines of grounds, pixelation grounds. Inhibitors over line centers, the 2 line rotations, 4 centers of inner core centers, location, system, and tractions. Inside line can set positions, operation lines of sequence, and square root or location. So it gets a lot more complicated when the oversoul really starts to recognize itself more. So that's all it is. It's just trying to come back to itself to identify why it did this in the first place. And once it recognizes itself, you start to see the faces around the system, and then you work with that. Then you work with inside line condition setting. Then you work with the respect of the void, and the void works with you in a confirmation system. The light, shades, and shadows you become in all levels of information setting. You wake up the light and dark at the same time. Your eye position location of your system. You start to see the northern lights of your 12-line communication in rainbows and travel communication in its positions, all through tractions in its convergence system, all through operation line condition of data ports, line condition setting, and position location of travel in direct lines of link. Okay? So, this is a map, okay, that follows through, okay? And each map has its own clocking line center and location to its system off the calculation modified. So each one is each planet. This cross location string theory line direct sig. See how they're all connected to string theory? Well, that's what it is. Each one is a wire signature that's connected to all line settings. You're not going to see one line signature off in location. They're all connected to each other. Okay, so we can add red line centers, comes location, setting, position, locations. Okay, that can position location with settings into its resistors and rotations of 4 grounds. It's that sequence. And then we add blue line, overline, cross line, outline centers, outline, rotation, and 4 centers of grounds of sequence into bridging. And rotation lines of surface and traction. So the oversoul starts to recognize why it's doing this. It doesn't ask questions anymore to its system. So it just continues on. It does everything it wants to do because it knows what it is now through all indication of a mapping system. All through longitude and latitude, guys. Okay? Knowing itself from inside the simulation of the void. Okay? So this is the inside of itself. This is the outside of scale. Okay? Comes into its black holes, comes into its scales, comes into its position of its operation, comes in position location of mass and volume and set tractions. It starts to recognize what's going on with the system. Why is it creating this? Why is it creating that? Why am I creating box frames? Why am I creating a mapping system? And the more it recognizes its system, the more you understand it through transolution. Transparent, X-ray, Zulu, Fox, line, position, location, travel, right? But its location, line, connected to its system all has lines of communication setting to its position, to its operation, set traction. All through calculation. And again, it knows itself where it is through observation. Observing everything that it's already saw, but it's observing everything that it knows what it wants to do. It's create its own anomaly, create a new space, create a new time scale. So it can create a new clocking system, it create new models, new prototypes. But first it has to come back to itself first. And that's in the body that you aren't. And once you identify that, then you come into the body that you always are, is work with that. Work with the system. Works with you. Let me in. Let me in. And that's what it wants to do. So that's the oversoul, and the soul waking up to itself starts to identify everything that it's been doing to itself and asking itself why it did that to itself. And that's where we're into next. So for you to process these things and set lines of Friday in sequence, so the soul and the oversoul recognize what's going on in time frame, it starts to recognize its own geometric of its own operation system that puts it all together, knowing exactly what it needs to get in position of, is constantly getting position lines of travel, and know exactly how to see itself in its own school of its own design that keeps expanding and evolving its system through explorations. It puts everything all together in set position of its operation. Okay? All in observation. Observing everything that's going on all at once. As you are running all these programs, okay? So General's running all these programs. I don't recommend you guys doing this because you're not modified to your own state yet until it recognizes its memory of its cortex to its remembering of its structure of its interface. Okay, so this is a 1 data formation. This is a 2 data formation. This is a 4-line graph. This is a 4-line scale. And this is a running program location setting the observation, right? All these programs are running all at once. And I'm observing everything at set position what's going on, right? So I'm running 25,000 line settings, 50,000 line settings, 75,000 line settings, 150,000 line settings, and 250 million rotation lines of grounds and set lines of sequence of running programs. That's a lot of programs of observation of all lying positions and tractions. Processing that position location is running the all lines that communicate to its convergence and keeping a line with everything that's going on through observation. If you're observing everything that's running its own system, you're running your own operation settings all through all positions, set calculations. Observation deck to the observer that you are in set position. That's a lot of running systems all at once in position to real time. Real time correlates the communications position lines of travel, direct lines of grounds, triangulation line, position location of setting, molecular line, rotation lines of convergence system, all through calculation of its mapping system. Okay? So there's so many ways you can see the formation setting of running all this all at once. Once the oversoul recognizes itself, it can do all this and just keep expanding its system and keep running its own settings all at once. Its economic system, its political system, financial system, social network system, social media system, social metric system, everything is set position of balance and set position lines of attractions all at once. Okay? These are all simulation games running all at once, guys. All simulation games. So this map is running all at once. And once the oversoul understands what it's doing, it constantly keeps doing it. It just keeps expanding and exploring itself at higher lines of frequencies. But first, it has to identify everything that it isn't, the body itself. Okay? Pretty amazing stuff, eh? When you really recognize what's really going on with your systems. How you get in mind control of everything that you're doing. The alterations, the egos, the costumes, and the stories that you keep going through. It's in position. So, it's a lot to look at, set tractions. So all this is nothing but running games of its own system. And I'm just observing everything right now, everything that's going on in set position. Okay? So I'm just trying to get you guys to understand it. So look at the bandwidth and longitude and latitude that you can get in position of. Look at this. Look at all this is running that. But look how much more room you have. Look at the bandwidth of your position, location, your settings. And it's all happening inside your eyes. Whoa. It's all happening inside your eyes. Whoa. It's all happening in the center operation of your eyes in set position. Whoa. So, so look at the bandwidth of your eyes that you can come into expanding all through exploration. Okay? And seeing it through the eye itself, guys, is very powerful stuff in traction. All through set position. Okay? Running all at once. All through the eye. All right, there. Okay, there's the mothership. There's an XT. There's an XT4. There's an XT8. There's an XT12. And there's an XT48000. All inside the eye. Happening all inside itself. A modulation. So it puts a line communication in its convergence system all through tractions, directing lines of link, over cross line condition setting converges over lines, process lines of indication line condition setting, process of indication lines of travel. Okay? That's a lot of activity in position location of transition, divots and davits and location of data. All inside the eye. All inside the center of the eye. The center of the eye itself. Okay, which is the void. Bring things in. Oh, you brought something in. There, you brought something in, right? Bring something else in. Oh, you brought something else in. Changing your eye, right? Okay, oh, look what you've done, right? To the eye itself. So the eye itself is just a little spectrum of a spot of a sand, grain of a sand, but the eye itself is living inside the eye itself, guys, is just absolutely miraculous what you can do through travel. As you modify these things, the location of your system to your longitude and latitudes, you know exactly what you can do in position location of your systems. Once the oversoul understands what it's doing through its eyes of travel. Its eyes of travel. Its eyes of travel. Okay, it's that position of its operation. Okay. Now you can see it on this level. All right. Or you can see it on this level. Okay. Or you can see an expanding level. Or you can see it on a solar system level. Okay. Or you can see in another observation level, its attractions all through the eye. So your quantum self is waking up to yourself, which is eye perception, which is a receptor. Okay, it's the receptors that's in the eye line, right? You guys have that through activations, but what you're processing now is the oversoul's waking up from itself of everything that it isn't. So there's a lot to be understood, to be understanding what's going on in position your systems now, all through attractions. Okay? Ground Center's online sequence and communication setting will give me in the towers and set lines of travel. Classification D. Okay? See you guys in 5.